Doing these three things was an absolute game changer for my landscape painting and rapidly improved them. Now, are you an artist that's struggling bringing your paintings to life? Perhaps you're having difficulty getting those tonal values right and creating the atmospheric depth in your painting, or just having trouble mixing some of those colours, getting the saturation of the colours correct? Well, I've been there myself, and this is partly because I'm a self-taught artist. But when I learned about these three things that I applied to my painting, it rapidly improved them. Now, the first thing I started doing was sketching, and you might think, well, that's pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised at the number of artists that don't do any sketching prior to starting a landscape painting, and I was one of those people. Now, I've been painting on and off my whole life, and I always loved landscape art, and I took a long period of time where I stopped painting, but then when I turned 30 I started painting again. It also coincided when I moved to New Zealand, where I live now, and for a few years I was painting intuitively. I was painting lots of mountain scenes, landscapes and seascapes, but then I was having real difficulty getting the depth in my paintings, and also my compositions were not good either. So after a while I realised that my artwork had plateaued. I couldn't seem to get the results I wanted, and I started reaching out to some artists, yet no one would help me. But in the end there was one artist that helped me, and he became my mentor for a little while, and his name was Andrew Tischler. So I actually went to visit him in Melbourne in Australia, where he was living at the time, and he showed me his whole painting process. And one of the things he asked me, he said, do you do sketches before you start your paintings? And I felt pretty silly because I was like, no, I don't. And he's like, right, well, you need to go and get a sketchbook and some pencils and start sketching. And so I did this immediately, and my painting started to improve from there on because my compositions improved. Now, the other thing about sketching is it starts to get you to understand the values in the landscape. So value is how light or dark your subject is, and the general rule of thumb is we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground. Yet as landforms recede, darks are not as dark and lights are not as light. So our value range in the distance is narrower than the full value range that would be in the foreground. So by doing pencil sketches, we can start seeing where all those lights and darks are in the scene that we're painting. Now, what I do is I start off with thumbnail sketches, very quick, they take about 10 minutes. I'll sketch out a few composition ideas, and then I will do a final pencil sketch, and then I can use that to refer to for the next stage in the painting process. So that brings on to number two. When I start my painting, I can refer to my sketch, and I've found that the easiest thing to do is to paint your dark values and shadows first. So for example, if we look at this mountain painting that I created, I started off with those distant mountains where the shadows are not as dark as they would be in the foreground. Then as I move forward into the landscape, into the midground, those mountain shadows are getting darker. And then as I come to paint the vegetation in the foreground, which are some of the darkest values in the landscape, especially trees, this is where I'm going to find my darkest values. Now, by painting these dark values first, it makes it much easier to then paint the areas in light afterwards and get the saturation or chroma of the colour correct. I did the same here with this mountain landscape. This is a scene, one of my favourite scenes in New Zealand. It's a big mountain valley, and in the distance is a mountain called Mount Talbot. And I started this painting in the same way. I started painting the cloud shadows, the shadows in that distant mountains, and then as I moved forward in the painting to the mid-ground tier of mountains, those shadows there are getting darker, and then our darkest shadows are going to be in the foreground, some of those shadows along the riverbank. So by approaching a painting in this way, it makes it easier to paint those areas in light afterwards. Now, I actually learnt this approach to painting through plein air painting or outdoor painting, and I was out with a load of painters, including a very good plein air painter here in New Zealand called John Crump, and he always says he paints his dark values first, and then it doesn't matter that the light changes or if it suddenly clouds over, you've got those dark shadows first, making it easier to paint the areas in light. And I started doing that when I was painting outdoors, and then I applied that to my studio work, and I found in the end that it just made the whole painting process a lot more structured and easier to do. Now, if you're an artist and you're struggling bringing your paintings to life and you need some help, or even if you're a complete beginner, then check out my free ebook, Beginner's Guide to Painting Landscapes. I show you a blueprint of how you can approach a painting and give you a methodology that you can use. I've put the link in the description box below. So this leads on to the third thing that I did to really improve my landscape painting, and that's to use a more limited palette. In fact, if you're starting out painting especially, it's actually easier to use less colours. It gives you a better understanding of colour mixing, and because you're using similar colours, it means your painting is much more likely to be harmonious, meaning that it will read well to the viewer. By using less colours, we're more likely to be using the colours that we've got on our palette throughout the painting, meaning that there's going to be relationships between all the zones in the painting. And as I say, it will just look much more harmonious in terms of colour and read better to the viewer. Now, when mixing colours, you can use more colours if you need them, but I've found that my paintings look better when I use fewer colours. So generally I use about 7 colours plus titanium white. Now, there was a time when I was using quite a lot of colours on my palette, but then I started to find it confusing. And then in the end, I found that some of the colours that I was using, I was able to mix with other colours anyway, and therefore limit my palette and whittle down some of those colours. So I think using less colours makes life easier, especially if you're learning to paint, and it gives you a better understanding of painting as well. Thanks for watching. Hope you're having a beautiful day and happy painting.